Welcome to the first series of Conversation on Value, a podcast about reframing value in business and society. I'm Valeria Maltoni, and I've been working on the question of value for more than 20 years. In an age when so much content is limp and lazy, including media content, when we are appropriate, precise, and thoughtful about the stories we tell, we create value. Today, to discuss this topic with us is Christina Patterson. Christina is the author of Outside, The Sky is Blue, and The Art of Not Falling Apart. While she's thinking about the next book, she's building a coaching practice with a related podcast, The Art of Work. On top of that, she's been doing her journalistic work, mostly as a literary critic for the Sunday Times, and discussing politics and current affairs on the Sky News Press Preview and BBC Radio 2, The January Vine Show. Conversation on Value is a podcast about how to reframe value in business and society. I'm Valeria, and I've been working on the question of value for more than 20 years. Hello, welcome, Christina, to the podcast.
I'm delighted to be on it, Valeria.
I was listening to a recent podcast you recorded, actually, The Art of Work, with the former VP of Twitter, Bruce Daisley. And I love the part when you and he discussed his new book on fortitude. And I love the word, and I love the reason why you discussed the change of word from resilience. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, in his case, his partner is Lebanese, and he was in Beirut at the time there was that horrific explosion. I think the biggest peacetime explosion anywhere. And obviously, everybody in Beirut was having a terrible time anyway. And then on top of that, they had this horrific tragedy. And they were waiting for international help and people to say, let's see what we can do for you. And instead, all the news reports started saying, oh, but the Lebanese are so resilient, as if that was an excuse to do absolutely nothing for them. And I think he had probably already decided he had a slight resistance to the idea of resilience. For example, he'd uncovered that the fact that in America, there has been so-called resilience training for American troops coming out of Martin Seligman's positive psychology movement. And it cost the American taxpayer tens of millions and was in fact found to be completely worthless. And none of this surprised me, because I'm not a fan of positive psychology anyway. I've always had this kind of joke that I'd love to write a book called, Why Negative Thinking Makes the World Better. In fact, I did once write a column with the headline, Why Negative Thinking Makes the World Better. And somebody wrote to me afterwards and said it had changed her life. So that's probably the nearest I've got to being a kind of guru. But what he doesn't like about the word resilience is that there is a kind of political component, which is almost, you're on your own, get on with it, we're not going to help you. And the business part of that is kind of all these books and courses on resilience, which have spread everywhere now. I don't know about in the US, but in the UK, in schools, in businesses and organizations, people are given kind of resilience training. I have no idea what happens in it because, I've never worked anywhere that does that kind of thing. But the point is, if you treat people properly and well and like humans, and if you manage people well, they shouldn't need resilience training at work. I mean, we all need resilience for life because life is deeply unfair, difficult, challenging, etc., as well as being full of beauty and joy and all the good stuff. But this idea that you can kind of, give people a 3-point program or something for how to be more resilient is absolutely ridiculous. And what I said to Bruce in that conversation was that when I was interviewed for my book, which came out in February, Outside the Sky is Blue, the journalist said, that quality that your parents had, which you have, which appear to have, which comes across in the book, I love it. She said, what do we call it? Maybe fortitude. And I thought, fortitude, that's exactly right. Because resilience implies you're kind of cowering against storms, whereas fortitude implies something more solid and braver, I think, and it's less political. So yes, I really liked what he had to say about fortitude, and also the way that he basically showed that a lot of this stuff, this kind of grit stuff, the Angela Duckworth stuff, the growth mindset stuff, the resilience stuff, it's basically rubbish. You know, the evidence just doesn't back it up. And I'm always amazed that business people sort of snap up these books as if they're some kind of holy grail and they're going to solve their problems. They're not. The world is complicated, nuanced, difficult, full of ambiguity. And frankly, anybody who claims to have an answer to it is clearly a charlatan.
I love the precision of the word, the fortitude, from the Latin root fortis, so being strong. And it evokes something interior. It's much richer.
Yes, I agree.
So that is a term to me that is more precise and more appropriate for the times that we're living, right? Yes. When I was reading, I actually enjoyed The Art of Not Falling Apart. I love the story that prompted that, because I related to that so much. And you have a bit in there when you talk about how anger is an energy. And I love that expression because, again, to go back to the, not having a fake positive, but, being a realist. Exactly. And, really feeling, what happens when you have something inside, and how can you then be okay with being that and using it outside. Can you give me a little bit more of the story around that?
Yes, well, Anger is an Energy is from the band called Public Image Limited that John Lydon, who was Johnny Rotten in the Sex Pistols, formed after he left the Sex Pistols. I interviewed him, and I didn't particularly know Public Image's music before. He's a very interesting person, and he's certainly changed since his Sex Pistols days. But I think a lot of what the Sex Pistols harnessed at the time that they shot to fame was this sense of anger. It was Thatcher's Britain at that time, and there was enormous anger and rage actually about her attitude towards wealth and poor people, this idea which kind of went along with Reaganomics, which was basically you're on your own, it's self-reliance. It's not far from the Ayn Rand philosophy, which is so beloved by so many on the right in America, and unfortunately increasingly, but thank God not now that Trussonomics is blown up in our face at vast cost to the British taxpayer. That anger came out of that political disengagement. There is now huge rage in this country after the catastrophic events of the last few weeks. And I'm a great believer in anger because it makes things happen, and no injustice would ever be ended without anger. Slavery would still be here if people hadn't been angry. Workers would never have won any rights if people hadn't been angry. So anger is absolutely an energizing force. And as you know, in that book, I do give an example of when I behaved extremely childishly. Having been fired from my job at a newspaper, I went to a literary party, and to my huge horror and surprise, saw both the editor and the managing editor who had fired me. And
I love that story.
Well, instead of cowering in a corner, I, in my high heels, much taller than both of these rather short men, marched over to them and said in a rather aggressive way, "Hello, how are you?" And they were just kind of desperate to run away. And one of them, the editor, kind of kept trying to sidle away from me, and I sort of sidled after him. And when the prize announcements finished, he literally walked out of the room, and the managing editor walked downstairs. I followed him, and he literally locked himself in the loo, and I stood outside and I said, "Would you like me to call security?" Which is what they'd said to me when I shouted at the editor. So it was fantastically childish, but it was great fun, and it cheered me up hugely. And I went home from that. I mean, it was a horrible time. Anyone who's lost a job knows how devastating it can be. And of course, you lose not just your income and your occupation, but also your status. Suddenly you go from, I was a columnist on a national newspaper, that's quite a high status job in this country, and after that I was nothing, and I was devastated, and I didn't have At the time, I didn't have a partner. I don't have a family, and work meant an enormous amount to me. And when that's taken away from you, unjustly, in my view, because shortly after I was fired, I was shortlisted for the main political journalism prize in this country, and I was the only woman on the shortlist. So clearly, it wasn't actually my work that was at fault. I think the anger I felt did galvanize me to move forward. But I mean, it is a fine balance, because I know that people can also be eaten up by anger, and anger can turn into bitterness. So I think there are no easy answers in relation to this stuff. It's, I suppose, the secret, as with everything, is getting the perfect mix of galvanizing energy and enough kind of equanimity and good cheer to get you through the day.
Well, and in that case, talking about that, I loved the story that you put in that chapter as an example, because it has humor in it, right? We can all visualize what happened, right? The guy cowering in the loo, and you kind of having this secret little dance inside, and finding the confidence. It's just when we can balance, as you said, the anger or the this energy, this force that we have inside, that prompts us to change something, with a dose of sense of humor, then that's probably when you were talking about the balance, right?
I think humor is absolutely key. And all the columnists I admire most, not all, but most of the writers, the journalists and writers I admire most, bring wit to their work, because, the world is a very difficult place. There are terrible things happening, particularly terrible at the moment, but there are always terrible things happening. And it's actually too much for us to take that all in. And I think one of the ways that makes it bearable and that makes life bearable is wit and humor. And it can be pretty dark wit. I mean, doctors, I think, have always survived through a hefty dose of black humor. I'm sure most people who work in a mortuary have a hefty dose of black humor. People working in healthcare generally do, certainly journalists do, even in, kind of pretty awful situations and tragedies. I think we need it to get us through, but also we need it in communication, because I do believe very strongly that all communication, if possible, should be enjoyable, whether it's an article, a book, a blog, a newsletter. I mean, you don't necessarily expect an email to be enjoyable, but the more you can kind of bring a lightness of touch to things, I think it just makes life nicer and easier, and it just brings a kind of little bit of sparkle to every day.
Tell me a little bit more about that, about how, as a writer, as a journalist, how do you know when, for example, you write an article, or you write a chapter, or you do a piece of writing, and you feel energized from it at the end, right? What's the process? Can you take me a little bit?
It's so difficult, because I don't teach writing, and I've never studied writing. So, I never studied journalism. I became a journalist in my late 30s, having done other jobs, mostly involved with writing. Poetry, actually. I was running the Poetry Society before that in London, and before that I was organising literary events at the South Bank Centre, which is the UK's biggest arts centre. So I've been an enormous reader all my life, and a critic since my mid-20s. But if you ask me how to do something, I can't really tell you, because I suppose it's that thing about unconscious competence. If you don't actively learn something, you're not aware of the mechanisms whereby you learn it. And so I don't actually know what I do, but certainly I could probably draw out some basic principles, like, if you are not interested by what you're writing about, you haven't got a hope in hell of interesting anybody else. And if you're writing something makes you smile, there's quite a strong chance that it will make somebody else smile. If, as occasionally happens, you're writing something that brings tears to your eyes, it's quite likely that it will have that effect on someone else, but only if you're good enough at the craft, because writing is a craft and it has to be learnt like all other crafts. And in my view, I mean, of course, all writers have different styles, and there are, kind of wonderful writers like Henry James, who in many ways, he loved his polysyllables and his extremely long multi-clause sentences. And I love Henry James as well. And I am a fan, in the right context, of long sentences. On the other hand, for the most part, I prefer short words. I discovered almost accidentally in my own writing, and it's very strange this, it was after I'd had cancer for the second time. I'd been off work for major surgery, went back to work, and I don't know why, but suddenly I found myself having to use more words than the other columnists to fill up the space in a column. And I think something about that experience, my kind of second significant brush with death, really concentrated the mind and made me more determined at an unconscious level to cut out the crap, to use a technical term, and get more to the heart of things. And I think that very often, kind of flowery, I've never been a flowery writer, but I think often when we're younger, we can have a tendency to want to sound clever. We know lots of long words and we think, why not use them? Nowadays, I nearly always try to use the shortest word I can find, because my experience is that it packs more of a punch. It's just much more powerful than using lots of long words strung together. And my experience at that time, when I started using shorter, plainer words, and obviously, you are still, as a writer, very much aware of the rhythm of the music of the prose. Using shorter words doesn't mean that the need for music, rhythm, for short sentences to be balanced by long sentences at the point when that feels right. All of that is still there. You still need to have absolute control of the prose. But at that point, when my prose became plainer, that was the point when I started getting emails from blokes in Starbucks saying, your column made me cry. And I think that was the point when my writing became more powerful, actually.
I love that, because it's something that I've experienced as well. When I know that I'm done editing, when there's nothing more to take out, but I have everything in that needs to be there, and it feels so exciting to get to that point. But I've been writing for years.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's not something people can do tomorrow. You can start, as with any journey, you start it, and then with any luck, you get better in time. But I do think one of the challenges that we as writers face now is that everybody thinks they can write, and everybody thinks they've got a book in them. And everybody has stories in them, but to turn those stories into something finely crafted that people will pay to read is a whole other matter. And I think it's a craft. And unfortunately, the flip side of people thinking that they can do it is that people think that reading and writing are worth nothing. So I'm constantly getting people asking me to read their books for free or look at, and I'm thinking, I'm a critic. This is my work. Would I call my plumber and say, oh, I thought you might fancy coming and redoing my bathroom? It's not a hobby, it's work. And it's as insulting as that. I do sometimes say that to people, and generally speaking, I'm polite, because I realize that they don't, for some reason I find incomprehensible, they don't realize they're asking me to do unpaid work for no reason whatsoever, even when I don't know them. I can't imagine why they don't realize that, but they are. I generally try to be polite, but I've been asked to be on panels for free, and you think, do you come and give your management consultancy or your barristers, for free for somebody you've never met? I find it breathtaking, actually.
It's interesting because a lot of that was brought about by when bloggers, came on the scene, and they started sharing so much of their, curiosity and even professional knowledge for free online. All of a sudden, it became, everything for free, and
Yes.
speaking for free at events. And all those kinds of things. But when you do things, do you think that I was thinking as you were sharing that, it cheapens a little bit the words, cheapens the language, and it's almost like, hey, anybody can throw some words. Even AI now can throw words on the page, right?
Absolutely. Samuel Johnson, who said only a blockhead writes except for money. And broadly, I agree. Now, obviously, anyone can do what they like in their spare time. If they want to write for free, absolutely fine. You're completely right. The ecosystem has changed, and now lots of people are blogging for free. I have a Substack newsletter, which I have to say, I feel, I sort of enjoy the writing, but I feel very ambivalent about it, because I do expect to be paid for my writing, and I'm not paying myself for it. So yeah, I mean, but it has changed. It has changed the ecosystem, and obviously we have to deal with the world as it is. The internet changed everything. It changed the funding model for newspapers. When newspapers gave away their content for free, of course, they exploded their business model. And of course, lots of journalists ended up losing their jobs, and the industry started going into a decline. I'm pleased to say that there has been some progress on that front, because lots of newspapers and magazines do now have a kind of hybrid model, or they charge for their content, quite rightly. And if I subscribe to masses of things, and if I share articles on Twitter, which I do all the time, and they are, you involve a subscription, people say, oh, paywall, and you think, yes, it's not oxygen, it's writing. You pay for it. You don't have to read this tweet, but if you want to, yes, you subscribe to the thing. And I think it would be lovely to see how bankers would feel if they were suddenly asked to do all their work for free. I mean, it's just bad luck that it hit writing, and there was this absolute explosion of content. And of course, there are pros and cons for any situation. There is a kind of democratization, to use that ghastly word, very polysyllabic word as well, of the kind of, writing and so-called content sphere. And of course, there are pros in that it gives, more opportunities for people to express their thoughts and so on. But the other part of that is you do have to have people who want to hear your thoughts. It's not just anybody can express their thoughts. Building an audience is something completely different.
Yes, I was thinking as you were talking about the writing part of your work, about the other part of your work, which is the coaching and the podcast, the art of work. And I love the topic. Work is a very interesting and forever fascinating, and as you just said, evolving, type of thing. We used to do more manual work, and now we do more intellectual work that comes out of our head. And one of the things that you said about your podcast, I think it was in one of the episodes, or maybe in one of your columns, is that you try to ask different kind of questions. And when you are talking with a guest, you listen in a new way. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
I don't remember saying that, but I mean, obviously, as a journalist, I've been interviewing people for many years. And so, for example, when I interview someone, I do a lot of research. So I do spend a lot of time doing the research, and then I'll, put down lots of questions. But when it comes to it, I almost never look at the questions. For me, it's a conversation, and it's really about just seeing what comes out of the conversation, keeping in mind the theme. And in the case of my podcast, it is about the fact that work is an art, and that any job is an art, even if it's a scientific job or a medical job or political job. It's in a way an art and a science. But what I'm most interested in is the art of it. It's how you fine-tune that, how you make it work for the people you are there to serve, and of course for yourself, how you find joy and fulfillment in it. because, we all have to do it. We all have to pay our bills. And it is, of course, in many ways a luxury to enjoy your job. But I also think if you are in the Western world and have a degree of choice about how you earn a living, then it's a real shame to hate your job. I think that's, a very sad way to spend your life, because life is very short and we will spend probably about a third of it at work. And you might as well get some pleasure from it and also feel that you are contributing to society in some way. So I've always been fascinated by that whole issue. And of course, even more so once I lost my job, because it was from an industry that, as I've said, was in huge decline, and people, there were job cuts. I lost my job as tranche of job cuts. And, there are realities. So in certain fields, when you lose your job, you're not going to get another one in that field. And particularly as you get older, there is another reality that, if you're 25, your options are different to if you're 55. And we have to navigate these realities. And I'm always a bit skeptical of people who say, oh, I lost my job and it's the best thing that ever happened to me. In fact, I did. I think I put in the book, that The Art of Not Falling Apart. I did meet someone at a dinner who said publicly at this dinner, because we all had to say something about ourselves. And I was kind of going around saying, oh, I'm practically suicidal. I've lost my job. It's terrible. I'm heartbroken. And he had lost his job and he was going around saying, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. And I said to him afterwards, gosh, really? Because it was I found it completely devastating. He said, oh, yes, I know. It's terrible, isn't it? And I thought, but you just said publicly, it's the best thing that ever happened to you. So I'm always quite surprised by that. I know that for some people, it can be a very, very helpful turnaround. Where they find, a fantastic new career, and that's wonderful. And one can always find, or not always, but very often find great new things in a new situation. But you can't always recover everything that you have lost. Again, that's just being realistic, I think. But so for me, I was, very, very devastated about that job loss. And in many ways, I still do miss having a column in a newspaper. I have a degree of freedom now that I love, and I do all kinds of interesting things that I love. And I've loved writing my 2 books more than anything I've ever done. So, there have been, and I love coaching actually. So there've been many upsides, but I would never ever go around saying, oh, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. It wasn't. It was effing awful. And but I am fascinated by how people make work, what makes someone really successful in their field, whether it's possible to be both a great artist, for example, and a wonderful human being, which is more important in my view than being a decent human being. But I can certainly see the benefits of winning a Nobel Prize. And so it's all that stuff. I think it's fascinating, really fascinating.
So I love it when you talked about there were some aspects of your job that were stressful. You talked about that in your book. But also there was the upside. You were a columnist. Right. And you had a steady job. You knew, what was going to happen. Now you have more uncertainty in your life. So what you're telling me here, it feels like the story, like that woman who stood up and said, was the best thing that ever happened to me. It's a story that we tell. I don't know why. Exactly. But, it's a story that is out there and we repeat it because we heard it. We've heard it somewhere else.
Yeah.
But the reality is much more nuanced, isn't
Exactly.
it? There are aspects that are better. There are aspects that are worse.
Exactly. Well, in fact, that person, he was a guy and he'd had a very senior job also on a newspaper. And in fact, when he lost his job, he actually did that thing of putting on his suit and going out every day with his briefcase because he couldn't face telling his wife and family for a week, which is quite heartbreaking. And I think probably many men have sort of more restraint and a kind of, slightly kind of less keen to peel off the surface of their ego and show the vulnerability underneath. I'm very sort of heart on my sleeve. So I think probably most people are not quite as open about it as I was when it happened to me about how awful it was. But you're quite right that it is a story people tell about themselves. And look, we all tell ourselves stories every day to get through the day, and that is absolutely fine. It's called being human. I suppose what I feel quite strongly is that, and of course we can't know the actual truth, there isn't an absolute truth, and we're not all totally in touch with our unconscious, and you can look at things any number of different ways. But I do also think that if there is an evident gap between the story we are telling and, for example, the body language we are indicating, or the tone of our voice, or even the circumstances of our lives as seen by other people, then there's probably an issue. And anyone who knows me knows I'm extremely honest. And I'm not saying that's particularly a virtue. It's just how I am. I find it very hard to say stuff I don't think is true. And I think in writing, it's absolutely vital, because I think if you write something you don't believe, people can sniff it, they can sense it.
Thank you again for joining us for this conversation on value. I'm your host, Valeria Maltoni, and I hope you'll join us again for our next conversation on Traces and Dreams. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your network and subscribe.